Welcome to Women Who Kick Glass, the podcast that dives into the fearless women who changed history and the fights that are still shaping our world today. From suffragists to civil rights activists, these women refuse to back down, breaking barriers and demanding change. And now, here's your host, an advocate, a storyteller, and a woman who kicks glass herself, Ann Potenza.
Helen Keller was an American author, disability rights advocate, political activist, and lecturer. Helen was only 19 months old when she had a childhood illness that left her blind and deaf. A lot of us heard about the story of Helen Keller through the movie The Miracle Worker, with Patty Duke playing Helen and Anne Bancroft playing her companion Anne Sullivan. So when I was doing research about the suffragists that helped get the vote for women, I was really surprised when I found speeches that Helen wrote on behalf of women's suffrage. So she's a remarkable woman when you realize with the disability that she had as a child, and that didn't stop her from still growing and moving forward. Helen was born in Alabama in 1880 and grew up on a homestead called Ivy Green. She had 4 other siblings, and her father worked for many years as an editor for a local newspaper. He also served as a captain in the Confederate Army. Her mother was the daughter of a Confederate general, and her family was part of the slaveholding elite before the American Civil War. Her father's side of the family originally came from Switzerland, and one of her Swiss ancestors was one of the first teachers for the deaf back in Zurich, Switzerland. In her first autobiography, Helen reflected on her colorful past, and she shared something very interesting that I think a lot of our ancestors could relate to. She wrote, "There is no king who has not had a slave among his ancestors, and no slave who has not had a king among his." So when Helen became ill at 19 months old, they didn't know exactly what caused the illness. They think it might have been meningitis or it could have been a form of influenza. And she did recover from the illness, but it still left her permanently blind and deaf. So at about 7 years old, Helen started to have about 60 signs that she was able to do with her family and with the cook and the cook's daughter that was in her household. And they were hand signs that they were able to communicate certain things from around the house. And Helen was also able to distinguish the vibrations of the different footsteps of the people in the house to know who was who. In 1886, Helen's mother read a book by Charles Dickens that was similar to her daughter's situation. It was a story of a blind and deaf woman who was educated and got an education. So she consulted with their family doctor, who introduced them to Alexander Graham Bell, who at the time was doing work with deaf children. And Alexander Graham Bell advised them to contact the Perkins School of the Blind, which was the school that was noted in Charles Dickens' book of where the woman got her education. And this brought them to where the school was in Boston. And it was there that the school's director asked Anne Sullivan, who was a 20-year-old alumni from the school and who was also visually impaired herself. And Anne became Helen's instructor, which was the beginning of a 50-year relationship, first as Helen's governess and then later as her friend. So Helen was 7 years old when Anne arrived at her house, and Helen said it was a day she would forever remember as her soul's birthday. Anne immediately started spelling the word doll in Helen's hand, D-O-L-L, because she had brought the gift of a doll to Helen. And of course, this whole process was frustrating because Helen didn't understand that for every object, there was a word, letters that would describe it. She remembers when she learned the word mug, that was so frustrating that she broke the mug because she couldn't get the words, the letters M-U-G. And eventually Helen said she just started imitating what Anne was doing in her hands. And she said she felt like she was just doing monkey gestures. But eventually they started taking form and they started making sense and it started connecting. They just kept doing it and it started to click. And in the first month, Helen made a breakthrough when Anne was signing the word water in her hand and running cool water over her hand at the same time. And she made the connection. And in Helen's autobiography called The Story of My Life, this is how she describes that moment. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that WATER meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. The living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, set it free. I get goosebumps when I think about that because to us it's so simple, but to her it was the whole world. And it was from that point on that Helen just wanted more, to learn more. And she had Anne sign in her hands all the objects that she could identify in her world. And Helen grew so excited to make this connection that she just started wanting more and more. And that was how she did it. Anne would sign the letters in her hand and taught her. And then she also learned Braille. So Helen had these two forms of communication. She was learning sign language in her hand. She was learning Braille, and she could also feel vibrations. So you have to think, she was missing two of her senses, but she was able to use her sense of smell, her sense of touch, and her sense of taste to discover new words. And that's how Helen started to learn to speak. She started feeling Anne's mouth and started feeling the vibrations coming out of her mouth. So Helen learned to hear people's speech by learning the Tadoma method, which means that you feel the lips and the throat of someone when they are speaking. And one of her most thrilling discoveries was when she learned that if she put her hands on top of a resonant tabletop, she could feel and experience music by feeling the vibrations through the table. So when Helen was 8 years old, she did attend the Perkins School for the Blind. And when she was 13, she attended the William Wade House and Finishing School with Anne Sullivan by her side. At 14, they moved to New York to attend a school for the deaf. And when she was 16, they returned to Massachusetts so that Helen could attend the Cambridge School for Young Ladies. And after that, she attended Radcliffe College of Harvard University, where at the age of 24, she became a member of Phi Beta Kappa and was the very first deaf-blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. When she was in her 30s, Helen did fall in love and become secretly engaged. His name was Peter Fagan, and he was a Boston Herald reporter who came to work as Helen's private secretary at a time when Anne fell ill. They wanted to elope, but it didn't work out. And eventually Anne got better and she resumed her role as Helen's teacher and companion. As an advocate for people with disabilities, Helen traveled to over 25 countries, giving motivational speeches about people with hearing disabilities. She also had speech therapy so that her voice would be better understood by the public, and she would give numerous lectures and speeches about the women's right to vote and the effects of war. In 1912, Helen joined the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies, and in her writings explained that her cause for activism came in part because of her concern for blindness and other disabilities. This is how she explained it in her words. I was appointed on a commission to investigate the conditions of the blind. For the first time, I, who had thought blindness a misfortune beyond human control, found that too much of it was traceable to wrong industrial conditions, often caused by the selfishness and greed of employers, and the social evil contributed its share. I found that poverty drove women to a life of shame that ended in blindness. And that last sentence actually refers to prostitution and syphilis, whereas prostitution was a life of shame that women used to support themselves, and which then contributed to them contracting syphilis. And when syphilis was untreated, it would be the number one cause for blindness. And it was the 1912 strike of textile workers in Massachusetts that actually instigated her support for socialism. And as a result of her advocacy, she was placed on the FBI's watch list. In 1913, Helen planned to deliver her speech, Women for Suffrage, in the large parade planned for Washington, D.C. for women's suffrage. The rally began in front of the U.S. Capitol and marched along Pennsylvania Avenue. And because it was a lengthy route, it allowed for a lot of press coverage, which is what they wanted to get attention for the women's suffrage. This was planned by the suffragists because it was the day before the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, and the women knew that this was the perfect timing to bring attention to the cause for women's suffrage. But with the good press that was there was also a lot of rowdy and drunken spectators. So there were 5,000 marchers for the parade route, but they were soon outnumbered by the crowds that started to gather. And the marching suffragists were jeered, harassed, yelled at, things were thrown at them. They were physically harassed. Men tried to grab the flowers off their coats or try to pull them off the floats. And the Baltimore Sun reported, Miss Helen Keller, the noted deaf and blind girl, was so exhausted and unnerved by the experience in attempting to reach a grandstand where she was to have been a guest of honor that she was unable to speak later at the Continental Hall. Helen Keller did not get to deliver her speech. And it was for this reason that when I was assembling the 19 speeches of suffragists that led to the passage of the 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote, I thought it was so important to include what Helen Keller planned to say that day. And this is what would have been her speech. Why women wants to vote. We demand the vote, not because we think we are better or wiser than men, but because it is our right as much as it is theirs. And even if we all vote together, we cannot abuse this right more than the men have done by themselves. There was already a good deal wrong with the world. Anyone who reads it all intelligently knows that. Perhaps one of the chief reasons for the chaotic conditions of things is that the world has been trying to get along with only half of itself. The two parts are unlike, and it takes both to make a whole. We demand the vote for women because it is in accordance with the principles of a true democracy. And it was another 7 years before women got the right to vote. But at least Helen was one of our suffragists that was able to exercise this right when it became the 19th Amendment. Most people have heard about Helen because of the movie The Miracle Worker, because she was blind and deaf. But most people don't know that she was an author, that she was a disability rights advocate, and that she went around and lectured, that she learned to speak. She spoke out on behalf of people with disabilities. She wrote over 14 different publications and essays that were published. She wrote books. She wrote a book about the story of her life. And even with her disability, she was able to get her voice out there. So we may know Helen for her disabilities, for being blind and for being deaf. But what lasts beyond that is her advocacy and her activism. Helen was a strong advocate and spent her life advocating for those with disabilities. She worked with the American Foundation for the Blind for over 40 years. She traveled extensively giving lectures and raising money for various organizations that would support people with disabilities. She was a suffragist and a pacifist, and she co-founded the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. And during and after World War II, she worked to aid blinded veterans, orphans, and refugees. So what can we learn from Helen, and how can we continue her work? Well, first, Helen Keller's life is a testament to the power of perseverance and human spirit. She helped change the perceptions of people with disabilities and show us their potential. Her work continues to inspire and influence disability rights advocacy and humanitarian efforts. And her life story is out there for us to see for ourselves in her books, in the movies about her, in her life's work of writings and lectures. She is out there inspiring us and others to follow in her footsteps. Right now, people with disabilities are facing even more challenges. There are laws being passed that are taking away their access to health care and making it harder for them to get an education and to experience life that most of us can take for granted. If Helen's life story inspires you, I urge you to learn and be aware of what's happening in our country right now. So if we can follow in Helen's footsteps and help those with disabilities to have the same opportunities we do, that we can help make that happen. There's a great channel on YouTube called the Helen Keller channel. And I watched so many videos, and you can see her actually signing and you could hear her speaking. And it's so inspiring. It left me in awe and motivated to share her story. And I hope that you share this episode, talk about it, and I invite you to join me on the next episode when we learn a little bit more about suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt. And until then, keep kicking glass.
Thanks for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more, contact the show. Visit womenwhokickglass.com. Until next time, keep kicking glass.